Welcome to IVF This, episode 160. What? IVF and ADHD. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well today. Today's topic is a little bit more niche. Doesn't mean that I don't want you to turn off the podcast episode just because you either don't believe you have ADHD or don't have a diagnosis of ADHD, because I do think that everyone has ADHD traits, or people experience moments of like ADHD traits. So I think you will find this episode valuable. But this really is kind of a love letter to my fellow ADHDers. I've talked a lot about how I have ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was in my early 20s, but I didn't actually start getting treatment or on medication until the last about 18 months-ish, the last year and a half. It just got to a point where my symptoms, although I've always been a chaos goblin, my ADHD symptoms have been much more progressive, which can actually happen postpartum. You can actually experience an exacerbation, as we call it, or a worsening of the symptoms of ADHD postpartum, because of the way that dopamine, which is the big thing that ADHD brains lack, we don't produce enough dopamine, and estrogen, which estrogen is a naturally occurring hormone, and they bind together. So dopamine is the thing that helps you do the things that you need to do. It's called executive function. And because ADHD brains have a lack of it, that's why you see a lot of the hyperactivity, the disorganization, the executive dysfunction. So when estrogen is low, dopamine is not pushed through. This is a very, very rudimentary way of describing it, but estrogen protects dopamine. And so when you have a low level of estrogen, which occurs during the luteal phase of your cycle, as well as postpartum, that makes your ADHD symptoms worse. Now, you probably don't need all of that background information, especially if you do have a diagnosis of ADHD. You probably know a lot about that, but I wanted to give a little bit of a crash course in what that looks like. So for people who maybe don't have as much familiarity with ADHD, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects both children and adults. It's characterized by symptoms like inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. When you're dealing with IVF, which is a highly structured, highly regimented process, that can be very challenging for someone with ADHD. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that that can be really challenging, how it's really challenging, I should say, and then how we can kind of work with our brains. And all of this is a love letter to my ADHDers, because, friends, I've had to live this many times for now 20 plus years. I think at this point in my life, I have now spent longer diagnosed with ADHD than I have when I was undiagnosed with ADHD. So a lot of the core things that we think about with ADHD in particular is that hyperactivity component. And it does look very different in women and men, boys and girls. The hyperactivity with boys tends to be much more external. That is traditionally how we view ADHD, is that hyperactivity component. For women and girls, that hyperactivity tends to look more like restlessness. It looks more internal, right? So it's the racing of thoughts, it's restlessness, it's unease. Untreated ADHD in women tends to look a lot like depression and anxiety. So there is a lot of challenges when you're talking about IVF, particularly with how physically, mentally, emotionally, financially taxing the experience can be. So let's talk a little bit about inattention and organization. One of the biggest challenges, my particular brand of ADHD, is the inattentive type. So keeping track of medications, appointments, various stages of the IVF process, it can be very overwhelming. I remember just before the start, I think it was my very first transfer cycle, I had gone on a work trip to a conference with my boss, who is also a very good friend of mine. And I literally left my Lupron. I was in this, I was in the start of the transfer protocol. And so I was I think I was stopping birth control and I was on the Lupron before I started adding the estrogen and then the progesterone. But I left my Lupron at home, and I was 4 or 5 hours away from it. And so all of the fear just welled up that night that I got into town and I realized that I didn't have my medication. You know, flurries of messages and phone calls to my doctor's office. And they were like, you know, it's okay to miss one dose. But if you can't get your medication or don't have access to medication, then we're going to have to call the transfer cycle off if you miss 2 doses. So that very next day, because of my inattention, and it does happen, I don't fault myself for it, but I spent an entire day literally in the Dallas Fort Worth area trying to track down a compounding pharmacy to spend I think it was like $300 for a 5-day supply of Lupron. It was an obnoxious thing that I had to go through, enlarged in no small part, I should say, to the inattentive nature of my ADHD. You could have put a gun to my head and I would have said that I had packed it, but I didn't. And the consequence of that was that I had to spend an entire day and a few more $100 on tracking down that Lupron, right? So there are so many details that we have to keep track that I think that adds to the mental labor of IVF, right? So I can remember multiple times checking, you know, the same calendar day. Am I taking this medication? Am I taking that medication? What's the dosage for this? I would I would listen to or watch a YouTube video, especially mixing the Menopur. If you know, you know, you have to become like a minor in chemist to mix one of the medications that are often used for stim cycles. It's called Menopur. And I would watch a YouTube video at least once or twice before each injection for the first week that I ever gave myself. Once you get used to it, you can become a little bit more confident in it. But I would double, triple, quadruple check what I was doing just in that heightened state of stress and frustration, right? There is that underlying anxiety that we experience, that I experienced. It was near constant that I was going to miss something crucial. Okay. That is a massive aspect of IVF and ADHD. Hyperactivity, which I said mostly can look like restlessness or difficulty staying calm during long waiting periods. Inherent in IVF, there's a massive component of hurry up and wait for IVF. The 2-week wait for embryo transfers to get to beta, particularly torturous. Someone with ADHD, myself, might struggle to constantly feel the urge to do something to distract themselves, which actually, in a lot of cases, for myself and my clients that I know have ADHD, would lead to a lack of rest or an increased state of stress, right? I can't tell you, I can't even begin to tell you how difficult it is for me to sit still, right? And not just like I have to be fidgeting with something. I mean, I move around, I talk with my hands a lot, I do those things. But just to sit on the couch and like watch a television show with my family, it can be excruciating for me because I have this like low hum restlessness that's just constantly like I feel like I'm making this hand motion that I know you can't you see if you're listening to the podcast, but it just always feels like I have to be doing something, right? That can be very challenging. during those periods where you do have to wait, right? You're either waiting for your period to start, you're waiting for your period to come, you're waiting for beta results, test results, you're waiting to start your protocol. All of that, there's a lot of waiting, and that is particularly challenging. Another aspect is impulsivity, hasty decisions, difficulty sticking to like dietary restrictions, even spending money. I know a lot of ADHDers, can sometimes have spending issues, spending problems. I will not ask my husband to weigh in on this, but we will use things like impulsively trying to change our diet or add supplements, sometimes without even consulting our doctors, in hoping to speed up the process, right? Improving our chances. But that is from a place of impulsivity, not necessarily measured decision making, right? They can sometimes go hand in hand. I think more often that's luck than anything. But that is an aspect, right? Um, One of my clients, I know she went impulsively. I didn't use that word with her because it can feel judgmental, but it's the act of impulsiveness, not a judgment on her character or anything like that. Went and bought a whole bunch of herbal supplements. She went to like Whole Foods or something, spent like $300 in herbal supplements, and then never talked about it with her doctor. And it wasn't until I think she went to either see an acupuncturist or some sort of complementary nutrition or something like that. And they went through some of her supplements and they were like, you actually can't be taking this during pregnancy, right? So some of the medications I think would interfere with the medications in her protocol, things like that. But because it's such a stressful experience, that impulsivity leads to making rash decisions, not because we are intentionally trying to do it, but because we feel that sense of restlessness. We're trying to outsmart the restlessness, basically. We're just trying to do something so that we don't have to feel that restlessness, and it can come back and bite us in the ass. Two of the biggest psychological challenges of IVF, the first one, which is still to this day, my biggest challenge, is emotional dysregulation. I know emotional dysregulation isn't necessarily thought of a lot with ADHD. And actually, if you go back into the literature, 30, 40 years when ADHD was, I think it would have been in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health, mental disorders, I should say. One of the first iterations, first or second maybe, had emotional regulation as one of the primary diagnostic criteria. And it doesn't have that anymore. It's starting to come back with the DSM-5 revision. But emotional dysregulation is one of the primary diagnostic criteria for ADHD. Just meaning we have a much harder time with hiding how we feel, but also regulating, meaning that if I get really angry, it takes me a lot longer and a lot more mental effort to calm myself down. If I get really depressed, it takes me a lot longer and a lot more mental effort to get back up to kind of a more neutral place, right? It can lead to very intense emotional reactions. And it's not just about feeling sad or anxious. It can mean swinging from hope to despair in rapid succession, which is exhausting. And that's another aspect that I'll talk about. But I know people talk about the emotional roller coaster during IVF and being constantly on edge. That is, for a lot of people with ADHD, particularly untreated ADHD, that's kind of our overall experience in life, is just feeling like that constant sense of edge. So you can imagine, if that's our baseline, how it would feel during IVF, right? If we already feel on edge and just kind of a restlessness always under the surface, you can imagine how much more intensified that is during IVF. I remember thinking, and my best friend also has ADHD. I mean, We've done a lot of things together. I feel like we probably didn't need to do IVF and ADHD together. We probably could have done some other things like traveling, but this is what we decided to do with our lives. But like, I remember talking to her while she was going through IVF and while I was going through IVF. We never did it at the exact same time, but just kind of coming together and talking about that process and how it was almost like every test result, every doctor's appointment, even just seeing like my doctor's name pop up on my phone when I would answer it when they would call, I literally felt like it could push me over the edge. It never did, but there was this constant sense of dread that would come over me. The emotional responses can be so intense that even small setbacks can feel enormous, leading to us feeling very drained and disheartened. Another thing that I don't think is talked about enough in the world of ADHD is rejection sensitivity and dysmorphia. Rejection sensitivity, ooh, it sounds strange if you've never experienced it or if you can't relate, but bear with me. The fear of IVF failing feels like a personal rejection. And as I talk about this particular section, I want you to remember that I said that everyone in the world has traits or can have experiences of ADHD without actually having ADHD. And I think this is probably one of those universal experiences that the fear of IVF failing feels like a personal rejection, right? That we are personally being rejected. Either our body is rejecting us, the universe is rejecting us, God is rejecting us, our partners, society is rejecting us, right? It can be very debilitating and exacerbate or worsen symptoms of anxiety and depression. Every failed cycle, every failed transfer, every month that you get that negative pregnancy test can feel like a personal failing. And I feel like, again, I think this is a pretty universal experience, even outside of ADHD, when you're going through IVF or when you've experienced infertility. I think this is a really shared experience for us. It and I think the putting words to it is so important because you're not crazy. There's nothing wrong with you. It's not, in fact, a personal failing, but it feels so incredibly personal, so deeply, viscerally, gutturally, gutturally, personally. Okay. It truly does feel like there is something fundamentally wrong with you, even in, light of all the logic in the world. It still feels like there is something fundamentally wrong with you. And there's not. It feels that way though. Okay. So this sense of rejection was not just from the process, right? It's not just from the process. It's not just from the failures or anything like that. It's from our own bodies, right? Again, when I say rejected, when I found out that I would need to have my ovary more than likely removed, it did end up getting removed. I almost felt like even my ovary was rejecting me, right? Even my ovary, I'd gotten, by that point of having to have it surgically removed, we had probably been trying almost a year and a half. And I was in the deepest depression that I can remember, outside of, like, I was medicated on Prozac when I was about 16, 15, 16, something like that. Outside of that experience, this was the deepest depression I had ever experienced in my life. When I found out that I needed to have my ovary removed, I genuinely was like, wow, even my left ovary is abandoning ship because I am that useless, right? Looking back, I can absolutely see the fault in my logic, but I can also see how I got there, right? I can also see and have so much compassion for that. Oh gosh, I was late 20s. I was 28 maybe when that happened, 29, something like that. I have so much compassion for Emily 10 years ago because I wanted something so bad that felt so incredibly elusive, so far away, and so foreign to me that I was literally feeling like my body was rejecting me, right? And I know that that's a common experience for us. I talked about anxiety and depression. Untreated ADHD can look a lot like anxiety and depression. In fact, untreated ADHD can lead to severe anxiety and severe depression. I think that that's something that really contributed to the severe postpartum depression and anxiety I had after I had my first one. There's so many moments where we feel like we're going to have a misstep, where we're going to have a, a thing that it's going to be our fault, right? For people who were not undiagnosed ADHD and not diagnosed until later in life, there is a core fundamental belief that we just screw everything up because we've been told that. I can remember my 5th grade teacher telling me that I was destined to be a screw up. Now, we can have another conversation about that individual and the way he was talking to a 5th grader, but it's still like that's still, there is still a wound there for me. And so this idea of like, I'm going to screw this up, I'm going to do something that's going to mess this up. And either it's not going to work, I'm not going to get pregnant, or I'm going to lose the pregnancy because of my own foul up. And just having that constant fear, that constant state of anxiety, it leads to worsening or a persistent state of anxiety that really just further complicates the experience. All of this leading to emotional exhaustion and burnout. The constant, this is again one of those universal experiences, right? Not just ADHD specific, but the constant emotional roller coaster can and will lead to burnout. Burnout isn't just about feeling tired. It is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by prolonged stress. Okay. Now, ADHD is a little bit more prone to burnout, and there is actually phrases like neurodivergent burnout, ADHD burnout, autism burnout. Those, because we're already in that heightened state almost constantly of prolonged stress. But just the experience of IVF, I think it can be a very universal experience because of that prolonged stress. No matter how long the process takes, how many cycles you have to do, best case scenario, it's still going to take you about 3 to 6 months, depending on the protocol, your experience, follow-up testing, things like that. That's a very long time to be that emotionally invested in something and that hyper focused. And then when you add on, right, burnout is often accompanied by a sense of hopelessness, and it can severely impact your overall well being. This leaves you feeling completely depleted, detached, and literally unable to muster energy or interest in continuing the process. A lot of us are just accustomed to white knuckling our way through, but that doesn't make it a great experience. I did an episode, I think it was episode like 48 or 50 on infertility burnout that I want you to listen to if you haven't or haven't listened to it in a while. But hallmark signs of burnout include depleted energy, increased mental distance from the fertility process, reduced personal productivity. Many of us can recognize it in like social isolation, despair, an overwhelming sense of fatigue that never seems to end. I remember a client of mine talked about burnout and how it was like she was walking through molasses all day, every day. She was emotionally numb. She like found it hard to engage in any activity, not just activities that she really enjoyed, but anything, right? Just getting out of bed. The emotional exhaustion makes it so difficult to stay motivated and hopeful, which is a big part of the IVF process. Another aspect of burnout is the internal critic becomes louder in times of stress. That drunk a-hole at the ball game that I've talked about before, just spouting drunken nonsense, comes much louder. The volume gets turned way up during times of stress. So your inner critic is probably also, on top of all of the normal BS it's telling you, it's probably also telling you things like you're not handling this well, you're not doing enough, you're going to fail as an IVF patient, you're going to fail as a mom, all of those things, right? The constant negative self-talk is also draining and leads to that perpetual feeling of burnout. So what can we do? I spent a lot of time talking about what it is. I just want you to know all of the things that I just talked about, deeply personal experience that I've had going through the last 20 years of just being diagnosed, as well as the last 10 years of going through infertility and IVF. There are ADHDers that find organizational tools can be very helpful. Calendars, alarms, apps designed specifically for medication reminders. There is one app that I actually use that's called Routinery, Routinery. I've set it up. I use it for just a few things. I don't dedicate my entire world to it, but a few things that I really want to make sure that I keep into a routine and like that discipline. So there are a lot of ways that it can be managed through organizational tools. Really, the biggest thing is breaking down the process into manageable steps, right? So it's not, oh my God, I have to look at my entire day and go through the process. We're going to go hour by hour. Okay. That's a lot of how I have to live my life so that I don't get so overwhelmed that I just go into ADHD paralysis and spend the entire day on the couch surfing TikTok. Mindfulness and relaxation. I find most of my mindfulness is through deep breathing and progressive muscle relaxation. But if yoga, journaling, if those are your jams, wonderful. Those are known to help with things like hyperactivity and impulsivity. They also give you a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic situation. Seeking professional support. If you're suspicious that you have ADHD, I would have you reach out to either your primary care doctor or your OBGYN. They have resources to help you get diagnosed. It can be, I should say, a rather lengthy process. So if you suspect that you might have it, go ahead and just make the call. Just do it. There's not going to be any harm in just making a phone call. Just make one phone call and then go from there. If you can always come to me for coaching. It's a special brand that I bring for IVF and ADHD. Cognitive behavioral therapy, if you have a counselor or a therapist, can be very beneficial. For me, one of the best things is kind of personal stories, sharing my personal stories and experiences. I think the more that we can relate these things to things that people actually experience, the less likely we are going to use them against ourselves and think that there is something wrong with us and pathologize things. Community support. I think Reddit has a relatively good. It's been a while since I was on Reddit on this particular subreddit around ADHD and IVF, but it's got a pretty good online forum. And all in all, I just want you to be able to find the resources that you need, the resources that you feel like would support you. Even if I know I do the Take Back Your Life call, even if you have no interest in working with me, but you don't know where to start, I'm a social worker by training. We'll find resources. You can book a call either on my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, or on my social media handles at ivfthiscoaching. Even if you just want to talk through your particular challenges without any interest in coaching with me, that's not a problem. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I just want you to have the resources and support that are going to help you through this process, whatever that looks like. So, kind of as we wrap up, I just want to extend the biggest hug and love and support for all of my fellow ADHDers, all of my fellow IVFers, ADHD or not. This is a really, really challenging situation scenario that nobody has like a how-to manual. None of us know exactly how to navigate it. If you listen to my last podcast episode, I talk a lot about you learn by doing, by finding your purpose by learning by doing. That's a lot of what it is. So if you're going into this process and you're like, I need to know how to handle myself, I need to know how to handle my ADHD, I need to know what a lot of it is just going to be doing it and learning from. One of the things that I tell my prospective clients is if you're willing to be wrong about yourself, that probably makes you one of the most coachable people in the world. So be willing to be wrong about yourself. That includes whether things are working for you or not working for you. But that also includes that maybe there's nothing is wrong with you. You've been just trying to make your brain work the way people tell you it should work rather than working with the brain you actually have. That was one of my biggest struggles when I was first diagnosed. So if you have any questions about ADHD, you can always reach out, even just by email, hello@ivfthiscoaching.com. All of this to say, I just adore you all. Don't worry if you feel like a chaos goblin. I am routinely a chaos goblin every single day of the week. And I just want you to know that there are real challenges with going through IVF when you have ADHD. There are real challenges of going through IVF when you don't, and that you don't have to do it alone. So I hope this was helpful. Have a beautiful week, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.